Okay, hello everybody. I'm going to begin the Kato FEF steam locomotive decoder installation. I'll be using a Micro Tsunami, the Soundtrax TSU 750 decoder. I'm also going to be using the 810140 current keeper instead of the stock capacitor that comes with the decoder. It's probably going to be adequate to use the capacitor, but this way, but with the current keeper, that should prevent any sound resets or stalls or anything with the locomotive in operation. And they are wired exactly the same. If you look at the diagram here for the capacitor installation, it gets wired between the green and blue wires on the decoder, and the current keeper is in fact, here's the diagram for that, is installed the same way. So basically where you would put the capacitor, you just put the current keeper on the Soundtrax decoder. So that installation should be pretty straightforward. There is available on the Soundtrax website a complete guide to the decoder installation on the or in the Kato FEF, and this is the guide that I'll be following along as I do the decoder installation. So it gives you a recommended list of materials, including the obviously a soldering iron and solder. You're going to need a 3/16 inch drill bit. That I believe is just for the for drilling holes for the sound to get out of the tender. And then it recommends some other things like tweezers and pliers and wire strippers and those kind of things. So we'll kind of go along and see how things go. And the first step in the installation guide is to basically remove the tender from the engine, and then essentially we'll be going through and installing or removing the metal weight and installing the speaker gasket and speaker in the tender. And again, this is where we'll be drilling some holes in the bottom of the tender to allow for the sound to escape better from that unit. So first step obviously will be to unpack the FEF itself. So basically you have to just gently pull on the drawbar and clips like so. Okay, and the shell does it's a press fit on, so you have to kind of wiggle out the bottom portion here. There we go. And then we need to remove this metal weight. That clips in and out easily enough. Okay, next we need to remove the center truck. It recommends using a small screwdriver to pry that off. And hopefully that worked out without breaking anything. Looks like all the tabs are still intact, so we're good there. And there's a spring here that you have to be careful not to lose. Okay, so it recommends installing the speaker gasket and using that as a guide for where to drill the holes, which seems reasonable enough. Okay, so it recommends installing the speaker gasket and using that as a guide for where to drill the holes, which seems reasonable enough. So we have the speaker gasket on there, and we'll use that as a guide for drilling holes, but we have to be careful here on the bottom since we do obviously need to clip the truck back on, so we want to avoid this area in here where the the clips are, and otherwise we'll have a problem keeping the truck back on. And so I think it recommends using this for a guide. I think I'll probably actually drill all the holes from the bottom side. This way I can make sure I avoid the areas where the clips need to go, and right in there, so that basically just drilling on the outside of those on both sides. So on the bottom there's actually, I tried to drill the first hole here, and I actually ended up hitting a metal strip that runs along the perimeter here of the tender, which carries electricity from the wheels to the drawbar and then to the actual main engine unit itself. And so there apparently is only going to be a space to drill holes here in a very narrow area around these clips, but not obviously in them. So we'll try to drill some new holes here. So there's one hole. You can see on the bottom how that is set up there. So again, I'll try to drill another hole here, 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 and then as close as I can to the middle without hitting those metal strips there that carry the currents. Okay, well I think I'll stop there. I have drilled 8 holes in the bottom through the bottom of the tender, plus there's obviously the holes for the mounting of the center truck as well, and so that should provide some additional areas for sound to escape. There's just really not a lot of space to drill more without damaging some aspect of one of those clips or the little little recess for the spring to go into, and so I don't really want to do a whole lot more with that. So we'll see if this will be adequate or not. In the directions, they have the solder points on the opposite side of the drawbar, so I'll go ahead and replicate that. Go ahead and install that truck so I don't lose the spring. So the problem with installing the spring is that it keeps being attracted to the magnet on the speaker, which makes it a little bit tricky to get in. Okay, so I'm going to have to pull the speaker off first before I put the middle truck back on, if I can get it pulled off. Okay, so I believe I have successfully reinstalled the center truck. And one more time, put the speaker on. Okay. So that concludes the non-soldering portion of the installation. And so the next step is going to be soldering the wires from the decoder to the speaker, and then to the power pickups on the front end of the tender. And next they go ahead and install the capacitor, but here we'll go ahead and be adding in the current keeper instead to provide a little bit longer of a backup, or a little bit longer of a power backup. They do give you 2 small sections of heat shrink tubing, which is nice. I do have plenty myself, but at least I know I have the right diameter that I'll need, which is handy. Okay, so the 2 purple wires on the decoder go to the speaker. The decoder will, of course, be in the tender with the speaker, and so I don't really need 4 inches of wire, so I'll go ahead and leave some so I can move things around, but I'll go ahead and cut those wires in half, and then we'll strip them. Okay, so I have a little bit of solder on the ends of these wires, and there's already solder on the terminals on the speaker. So this is going to be a little bit tricky because you need to install or solder the wires here to the right and left wire in the drawbar. But you can see here that those 2 wires are extraordinarily close. Okay, you can see here the wires are extraordinarily close together. and so we need to solder on either side of there, and obviously be very careful we don't melt the plastic here to where those wires will touch, or potentially drip a little bit of solder in there and bridge that connection, creating a short. So this is going to be a little bit tricky to do. It may in fact be easier to, there's not going to be a lot of room though there either, but another option is to solder onto the contact plate, which is a little bit difficult to see here. There's the little brass or copper strip here underneath, right above the wheels, that this wire on the drawbar brushes up against, and so that might be a little bit safer, but there's not a lot of room in terms of wheel clearance, and so we'll have to try to make that a pretty flat solder joint. But I do feel a little safer doing that than trying to solder on the drawbar, since any melting of the plastic there is going to be pretty much disastrous for the performance of the locomotive going forward. So I'm going to go ahead and try to tin those plates there and see if I can use those as the connection points. Okay, so you can see I have the red and black wires connected there right above the wheels. It may have been easier to try to do it on the drawbar itself, but again, there's a lot of risk for shorting those wires out there, so we'll try it this way and see how things go. But now the next step is to connect the Keepalive. Okay, so we need to cut this blue wire half, or if we're careful we can strip this but not cut the wire. This is the Keepalive unit. I've got the wires to that stripped, and so I'll start with the blue one, put the heat shrink tubing on, and then I stripped a section of wire here right in the middle of the blue wire from the decoder. Let's take a little bit of solder to secure that, and we can slip the tubing on. Wires everywhere. Okay, so we have that soldered securely. Now we just need to slide the heat shrink tubing over the connection. And I'll just use the heat from the soldering iron to shrink that tubing. So that's secure. Okay, so now I can solder this wire. Let that cool a bit. One thing when you're doing the heat shrink tubing, you don't always want to try to slide it over the very hot solder joint, as this passing over that will sometimes cause the tubing to shrink right away, and then you can't get it all the way across the connection. But it's quite cool now, so I can slide that across. This would be the time to install the rear light on the tender. However, I'm not going to be doing that. One, because I didn't think about it, and two, I do have the water tender units that go with the whole set. And I do have a light for the for one of the water tenders. So when I have that in the series, the rear water tender will have a working light. Not installing a light on this tender. I can remove yellow and the brown wires shorts since we're not going to need them. I'm not going to fully cut them away though, just in case I do change my mind at a later time. Okay, so now it recommends trying to reinstall weight on here. You can either cut this in half, and try to stick it on there. Probably actually more than that, but just cut off pieces. But again, I do have stick-on weights somewhere. I do have these iron stick-on weights, and so I'll be trying to use those. Hard to see this, but there's some plastic support tubes here in the middle, and those cannot stay. It says use a Dremel and remove those. I have a Dremel, but I'm just gonna go ahead and nip them away. Okay, so I just snip that mostly away, so there should be enough clearance. I'm going to try to install one more weight on the front if I can. Okay, so one last thing is that my blue wire here is not going to be long enough to reach across to the actual engine, so I'm going to extend that with this other blue wire I have. Here, but the white, orange, blue, and gray wires are the ones that need to go across to the main, to the actual engine. And we need to get everything untangled. To keep this together, I'm going to use another piece of heat shrink tubing. I think will fit all of them, and this will also make it black, so it'll be a little bit not, you're not going to see the different colored wires going through or going across if you look closely. Try to tape things in place here. Okay, so now I should try to get this shell back on. Try another orientation of things. And we have a winner. Okay, so let's kind of review how I oriented things. The only way I could get it to fit was to put the Keepalive unit in the front and the actual decoder in the back, and then sneak the wires around the side. Otherwise, there just wasn't quite enough room to... The Keepalive is taller than the decoder, so having it on the back didn't quite allow it to fit in the middle. Get my tubing back in there. anyway, we at this point we now have the decoder, the Keepalive unit installed in the tender. All the wires coming out, and this will then connect into through the bottom here into the we'll have to wire that to the motor and to the front lights. But this is where I'm going to stop for today. In the next video, we'll look at how to wire this up to the actual main unit and get everything hooked up, and then hopefully test it out and see how it sounds and how it works. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.